About 50 years ago, an astronaut returning from the moon experienced things that he couldn't find a scientific explanation for. So, with some colleagues, he launched a new science focused on the mind and how it works in the body and across space and time. It's the field of Noetics, where the tools of modern science are used to help us understand how what we think and feel affects us and the world around us. Now, this is Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments from the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon.
This is Noetic Moments, the show that explores what consciousness is, what it does, how it works, and how our lives could be much fuller if we understood it better. And I am Ruth Miller, a longtime student of consciousness, cybernetics, and culture, and through this series of programs, I'm introducing some of the people whose work has defined this field of research, and I'm explaining some of their ideas and experiments. I'll also explore relevant news items and answer questions that you send to my email address, ruth@noeticmoments.org. Over the course of these programs, we've learned that although the medical world defines consciousness as what we're aware of now, most of what goes on in the mind is not in our conscious awareness at all, but goes on in unconscious processes. From Jung and Freud and other early researchers, we learned that our minds can be thought of as having three aspects: our normal awareness, the conscious mind; what keeps our bodies going and includes our fears and beliefs about threats and dangers, the subconscious mind; and what connects us with our highest ideals and guides us in our actions, the superconscious mind. We learned that we can change our state of consciousness so we're aware of different aspects of mind at different times. And then we learned that the brain modifies whatever sensory signals it receives to fit past patterns of experience, following a default network in the brain. This means that we receive, perceive, see, hear, taste, and feel what we expect to experience based on the past. We also saw that our body often responds faster than nerve impulses or chemicals can travel, and before we're aware of it. Some experiments have even demonstrated that a person's mind continues to perceive and process for as much as several hours, even when the brain and heart are flatlined and the person has been declared dead. Then we learned that no one has yet been able to pinpoint how ideas and thoughts are formed in brain tissue. Based on all this, many scientists have come to accept that what we call mind is not the product of the electrochemical activity of the brain, but is in fact the activity of a field that surrounds and permeates the whole body. This field may be at least partly electromagnetic, because it's possible to measure electromagnetic activity for several inches around the body in what some say is an egg shape, extending from below our knees to a few inches above our heads. Mind, then, is a field, a pattern of energy that exists whether the body is functioning or not, and permeates and develops with the body and the brain. The brain, therefore, is best understood as a receiver-transmitter, receiving messages from the mind and transmitting them to the body, and receiving messages from the organs and senses and transmitting them to the body and to the subconscious mind. We've learned that this field of mind organizes energy and matter in a variety of ways. For example, the experiments in quantum physics, where subatomic building blocks of the universe show up as energy or matter, depending on whether a mind is present to observe them. Or people's bodies and pets that have been observed to change when someone they're connected with turns their attention their way. Individuals who've changed the patterns of numbers in what should be random grids on their computer screens or printouts. And the changes in the readouts from random number generators on the network of computers run by the Global Consciousness Project, reflecting the collective human field of mind. Now, every field is a unique pattern of vibration that's different from other fields, and they vibrate along similar patterns, resonating with each other. So minds affect each other across space and time. We've heard from a growing number of scientists who are seeing individual mind as part of a larger field, and they're beginning to equate the mind with the quantum or zero-point field out of which all matter and energy arises. And some researchers are using the equations of quantum mechanics, relativity, and computer learning algorithms to describe the role of consciousness in the formation of matter. There's more research on how the two hemispheres of our brain are involved in the information we received from the world through the left hemisphere and from our mind through the right. These understandings help explain things like the law of attraction, the idea of an akashic field that we can access through intuition, insight, or channeling. They help us to understand how dreams affect the body and our larger consciousness, how music affects the brain, the body, and connects us with other fields of mind, how we can enhance or slow down healing through our thoughts, emotions, and visualizations, and how the belief in a treatment can help a patient experience healing in the placebo effect, how remote viewing and telekinesis work, and how we can get into that state of flow in which the mind and the brain are synchronized, maximizing our effectiveness. You can catch up on these past shows on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where you'll also find links to the clips, books, and authors that I mention. And we're almost caught up. Now, I thought today we would follow up on this idea of mind as a field that could be equated with the quantum or akashic or zero-point field. We're going to be listening to something by Philip Goff. He's a philosopher. He has contributed to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And in there he says, Panpsychism is the view that mentality is fundamental and ubiquitous in the natural world. This view has a long and venerable history in philosophical traditions of both East and West, and has recently enjoyed a revival in analytic philosophy. For its proponents, he says, panpsychism offers an attractive middle way between the physicalism on the one hand and dualism on the other. The worry with dualism, he tells us, is the view that mind and matter are fundamentally different kinds of things, is that it leaves us with a radically disunified picture of nature, and also the deep difficulty of understanding how mind and brain can interact. He goes on to say, and whilst physicalism offers a simple and unified vision of the world, this is arguably at the cost of being unable to give a satisfactory account of the emergence of human and animal consciousness. Panpsychism, strange as it may sound on first hearing, promises a satisfying account of the human mind within a unified conception of nature. So I'll let him tell us more about this.
We cannot avoid this theoretical choice. Do we put the physical world first and try and get consciousness out of it? Do we put consciousness first, try and get the physical world out of it? Or do we take both? I think the first option, the materialist option, nobody has ever made the slightest bit of progress on its central explanatory task. No one's managed to at all explain how you're going to get consciousness out of purely physical processes. The second option, the panpsychist option, I think it has been shown how we can do it. The problem is essentially solved. And here I think this is the influence of Bertrand Russell, I think should be seen as the sort of Darwin of consciousness. Certain important work from the 1920s, I think he essentially showed how we can account for the physical world in terms of deeper underlying facts about mind or consciousness. So we've essentially got an answer there. Dualism, I think, is a coherent possibility, but as scientists and philosophers, we try and respect Occam's razor. Why believe in two kinds of things when you can believe in one? So I think that pushes us towards the first two options. So, materialism we've never made the slightest progress on, and I think there are good arguments that it's in some sense incoherent. Panpsychism is simpler than dualism, so that's the view we should go for.
All right. So for a scientist and a theorist, Occam's razor says materialism isn't doing the job. Dualism is two things. Let's go to a single thing, and let's say consciousness is present at the fundamental levels of the universe, and that under certain circumstances, it shows up as conscious entities. Here's another description that's a little more fun you might enjoy.
Panpsychism is the idea that consciousness, or you can say mind-like qualities, exist everywhere in the universe, in all things all the time. However, there are different levels and degrees of consciousness. The tiniest, most fundamental element of matter, right down to the subatomic level, also known as monads, will contain conscious qualities. However, these monads will vary in degrees of conscious strength. How conscious something is depends on how complex the entity is and how many strong conscious monads the entity contains. So, an inanimate object like a rock will have very weak conscious monads. A plant, slightly increasing in complexity, will contain slightly stronger conscious monads. An insect, a more complex organism, will then have slightly stronger conscious monads. An animal, even stronger conscious monads, and a human will of course have very strong conscious monads. This does make perfect sense, as we can see varying degrees of consciousness and sentience throughout our natural world. We can even go so far as to say humans themselves contain varying degrees of conscious monads, giving rise to the existence of super geniuses. Right. Now the universe as a whole, the most complex and greatest entity, contains the total sum of all monads that exist, as well as the power to create these monads, which would make the universe the highest form of consciousness possible. Again, this is exactly how we understand the classical concept of God, but we are breaking it down to a more empirical understanding. God is therefore the total sum of all consciousness in the universe. It is not separate from the universe, it is the universe.
Okay, so we're looking at an idea that even Plato thought was probably the case, and William James and Bertrand Russell, who is mentioned in one of those, also were supporting the idea that consciousness has to pre-exist things. And Phil Goff's book in 2019, Galileo's Error, argued forcefully for the idea. And there are a number of other folks, more modern, who have been interested in this. One of them is a man named David Chalmers, who is a philosophy professor also. He embraced a form of panpsychism and suggested that there's even awareness. He said in one TED Talk that a photon might have some element of raw subjective feeling, some primitive precursor to consciousness. And neuroscientist Christoph Koch noted in his 2012 book, Consciousness, that if one accepts consciousness as a real phenomenon that's not dependent on any particular material, that means it is substrate independent, as philosophers like to put it. Then he says, Christoph Koch says, it's a simple step to conclude that the entire cosmos is suffused with sentience, which is in fact what our second recording was saying. So this idea of panpsychism is totally supporting our idea that each individual mind is a field within larger fields of mind, ultimately the mind that is all that is, which most folks call God or Spirit or Lord or Brahman, of which our individual mind is Atman, or Allah, or any number of names depending on the culture they grew up in. So what we're saying here is that each of our individual minds is an aspect of the totality of mind that is all that is. That opens all kinds of possibilities, doesn't it? To underscore that point, let's hear what Rupert Sheldrake, the man who suggested that all mind is a field interconnected in morphogenetic fields, what he has to say about this.
Oh, I'm pro-panpsychism. I just think most panpsychists don't go far enough. Most panpsychists talk about the consciousness or minds of electrons or protons and atoms and things like that. which is fine. The reason they do that is because they're trying to explain how we come to be conscious.
They just don't go far enough. Isn't that marvelous? Sheldrake has done such great work. We have really benefited from his research. And not only from his research, but all of the ways that people have been able to apply his ideas. The world, the mind, the universe, all one thing. All kinds of possibilities are opening up. It's wonderful. Well, if you just tuned in, you are listening to Noetic Moments, a radio show exploring what consciousness is, how it works, and how our lives can be greatly enhanced as we understand it more fully. I am Ruth Miller, your host, and that sound tells me it's time to look at a book, answer any questions you've emailed to ruth@noeticmoments.org, and sometimes, maybe, take a look at what's going on in the news or in most recent research that can help us understand the role our state of consciousness plays in our experience. I thought we might spend a little more time with this guy, David Chalmers. He's quite the character. He looks like the classic hippie philosopher in his 2011 headshots. Long hair, long beard, wild eyes. He's written a number of books. The Conscious Mind in Search of a Fundamental Theory was back in '96. Toward a Science of Consciousness, 3, the third Tucson discussions. It's an overall thing there. He was working with Stuart Hameroff, who we worked with before. His book, Philosophy of Mind, Classical and Contemporary Readings, was 2002. It was one of those editing jobs that academics have to do. But then he followed that up with The Character of Consciousness in 2010, Constructing the World in 2012, and his most recent one, Reality Plus, Virtual Worlds and the Problems of Philosophy. David Chalmers is, as I say, an interesting guy who shows up in interesting ways on the planet, and people have found him to be very useful. His website includes a photo of him on a very, very, very old computer as a very, very young man, perhaps a boy. I am a philosopher at New York University, he says. Officially, I am University Professor of Philosophy and Neuroscience and co-director of the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness. I'm also Honorary Professor of Philosophy at Australian National University and co-director of the Phil Papers Foundation. He says that the site includes quite a bit of his own work, and his most recent book is highlighted. He has a number of his papers up there. A fundamental core to his understanding is a paper that he wrote called Consciousness and the Collapse of the Wave Function. It was published in 2020 and in 2021. And he was talking at Fermilab. He was talking to physicists about how the idea that a wave, which is an expression of energy, collapses into a particle in the presence of an observer. So he's saying that consciousness is participating in the process, but he's also saying that this wave must be aware of the observer and choose to collapse in that environment. And that goes back to a book we talked about some time ago, The Quantum Self by Dana Zohar, where she was saying that that choice function is the fundamental root of all consciousness, the capacity to choose in a specific environment. So there's all kinds of interesting things. If you're interested, you can follow up on David Chalmers' website, which is consc.net, and I will have that on the description on the noeticmoments.org site. So let's look at this book, Reality Plus, Virtual Worlds and the Problems of Philosophy. In the contents, the introduction is called Adventures in Techno-Philosophy. Part 1 is Virtual Worlds. Is this the real life? What is the simulation hypothesis? We'll spend some time on that. I think you'll enjoy it. Not in this book, but other places. Part 2 in this book, Reality Plus, Knowledge. Do we know things? Chapter 4, can we prove there is an external world? Chapter 5 is it likely that we're in a simulation? Part 3 is, what is reality? Is universe made of information? Did simulation create it from bits? So clearly he's attached to this notion that there is a mind creating a reality that we are occupying, very much along the lines of the Matrix, but that mind is not machines that were invented by humanity and got warped. Part 4 is the exploration of the technology of virtual reality. Do virtual reality headsets create reality? Are virtual reality devices illusion machines? Does augmented reality lead to alternative facts, etc.? Part 5 is the nature of mind. How do mind and body interact in a virtual world? Can there be consciousness in a digital world? Part 6 is value. Can you lead a good life in a virtual world? Do simulated lives matter? Part 7 is foundations. What do our words mean in virtual worlds? Do dust clouds run computer programs? Have we fallen from the Garden of Eden? He is exploring in this book the relationship between the ideas and technology that we call virtual reality and the philosophy that includes this idea of panpsychism. So he says in his introduction, I've had all sorts of interesting experiences in VR. I've assumed a female body. I've fought off assassins. I've flown like a bird. I've traveled to Mars. I've looked at a human brain from the inside with neurons all around me. He goes on with several other examples. And he said that Zoom was also relevant to this idea. He says Zoom is convenient, but it has many limitations. Eye contact is difficult. Group interactions are choppy rather than cohesive. There is no sense that we're inhabiting a common space. One underlying issue is that video conferencing is not virtual reality. It's interactive, but not immersive. So he started playing with augmented reality. He says AR systems are also progressing fast. These systems offer a world that is partly virtual and partly physical. The ordinary physical world is augmented by virtual objects. He says, I don't yet have my own augmented reality glasses, but companies are said to be working on them. He says, but these temporary limitations will pass. The physics engines that underpin VR are improving. In years to come, the headsets will get smaller and will transition. We will figure out how to handle touch, smell, and taste. We may spend much of our lives in these environments, whether for work, socializing, or entertainment. Going on, he says, sometimes VR will place us in other versions of ordinary physical reality. Sometimes it will immerse us in worlds entirely new. People will enter some worlds temporarily for work or for pleasure. And he goes on. Now, what's really interesting about this is that there's a lot of science fiction addressing just exactly this. My daughter's favorite is Snow Crash. And one of the ones I'm reminded of is a story that I was studying when I was looking at how science fiction was describing life-extending technologies. And people were living in virtual reality worlds in their headsets, not even aware of their physical bodies. Machines and people took care of those bodies. So this is something that we're going to be dealing with probably very much in the next 50 to 100 years. He's talking about all the ways that simulations can lead us to a very different way of experiencing life. So then he asked the question in the introduction, could you be in a virtual world right now? So he looks at all of these questions. What is consciousness? What is reality? He was reading René Descartes when he was in his late teens. Descartes, he says, approached the problem by asking, how do you know that your perception of the world is not an illusion? How do you know that you are not dreaming right now? How do you know that you're not being deceived by an evil demon into thinking all this is real when it's not? These days, he might approach the problem by asking the question, how do you know you're not in a virtual world? So David Chalmers writes well, It's exploring fascinating concepts. And if you know folks who are saying, oh, I think it's all a simulation, you might want to pick up this book, Reality Plus, Virtual Worlds and the Problems of Philosophy. Well, we're out of time. That's it for today's show. But remember, you can continue the exploration on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where there are links to archive past shows, along with links to the titles and other resources we refer to on the show, and where you can send me your comments and questions, which I will do my best to get answered the next time we're on the air. For now, thanks for joining me here on Noetic Moments, recorded in the studios of KXCR Community Radio, which is financially banked by you, the community, and nobody else, in Florence, Oregon. Have a wonderful week.
You've been listening to Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments. This program is produced in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in beautiful Florence, Oregon, supported by you, our listeners. Our theme music is Tumbling Planets, composed and performed by Jeff Lovejoy. To hear this program again or learn more about Noetic Sciences, search our website, www.noeticmoments.org.